Most folks think they can tell exactly who's in charge by looking at the name on the door or the height of the office chair. But the truth is usually buried a lot deeper than that. Some people spend their whole lives trying to look powerful, while others just quietly become the power themselves without ever raising their voice. The clock on the wall said exactly 3:12 on a Friday afternoon when he decided to hit send on that email, making sure 16 different people were copied on the message just to make it sting a little more. To tell you the truth, I didn't even have to open my inbox to know something was up because one of the guys down on the assembly floor caught me and gave me the heads up before I even sat down. Just like that, 19 years of my life were boiled down to two cold sentences by a kid who had no idea what kind of fire he was about to start. My name's Marcus Hale. I'm 54 years old, and I've put in nearly 2 decades of sweat at Slocum AG and Equipment Corporation. I started out right there on the floor, bolting together combined headers and checking hydraulic lines for leaks, and I worked my tail off until I finally made it to Director of Operations. Then, on a random Friday in October, the founder's 27-year-old nephew decided to blast out a 2-line note to the whole team. The message said that, effective immediately, my role was being restructured from Director of Operations down to a floor shift coordinator, claiming they needed forward-thinking leadership instead of my legacy habits. It was signed by Tyler Grayson, who'd given himself the fancy title of Chief Transformation Officer. I was standing out in the parking lot when I read it on my phone because Denise Harper, one of my supervisors, had forwarded it to me with a 3-word text asking me what the heck was going on. I didn't even bother replying to her. I just stood there, read that insult twice, climbed into my truck, and started the drive home. In a single moment, my salary was getting chopped from $210,000 down to $136,000, which is a 35% pay cut delivered like a standard quarterly memo. Now, you have to understand who Tyler Grayson is to really get the picture. The kid is 27, got his MBA from Vanderbilt, and spent less than a year at some consulting firm in Nashville before showing up here. Nobody on the board ever actually voted on his title. His aunt, Eleanor Grayson, just wrote a memo 9 months ago and handed him the job. A few of the other directors tried to speak up against it, but she just shut them down and did it anyway. The kid has never actually touched a piece of the equipment we build in his entire life. I came to this company when I was 35 after a buddy of mine in the industry gave me a referral, and I was on the floor working within the week. I learned every single station in Bay 1 in my first 6 months, became a supervisor in 2 years, and was running the whole plant by year 6. I earned every promotion I ever got based on the numbers I put up, not because of whose blood was running through my veins. Every single year, I followed the same routine of showing up early, getting the job done, and putting my bonuses into the company stock. But there was a side to that story that nobody knew about except for one person. It all started back when the company was still being run by Victor Langford, the man who really built the place alongside Lorraine's late husband, Roy. Ned wasn't a Slocum, but he was a legend who still walked the shop floor every Thursday morning, even at 71 years old. He'd stop at a station, watch you work for a full minute in total silence, and then ask you one real question and actually listen to what you had to say. During my second year, he stopped by my station while I was reworking a hydraulic sequence I'd come up with to drop our defect rate. He didn't say a word at first. Then he reached into his coat and handed me a silver pen with an engraving that told me to own what I built. He told me straight out that holding paper without equity didn't mean a thing. Ned passed away 4 years after that, but I kept that pen and I took his advice to heart. I started out with the employee stock plan, taking that 15% discount they offered for reinvesting bonuses. While everyone else was busy buying new boats or taking fancy vacations with their extra cash, I was quietly stacking shares every single quarter for 19 years. Eventually, I started making private moves too. Whenever an executive retired and wanted to cash out their shares, I was right there to buy them up at market rate through my lawyer. I bought out the VP of procurement 14 years ago, the quality director 3 years after that, and the outgoing CFO 8 years ago. Just last year, I picked up the plant manager's block within 2 days of him announcing his retirement. I made sure every single transaction was legal, documented, and filed with the SEC under a trust called Donovan Holdings. It was all there in the public record for anyone who cared to look, but nobody ever did. My attorney, Samuel Prescott, was the one who came up with the trust idea. We were buddies back at Purdue in the engineering program, and he ended up becoming a heavy hitter in corporate securities law. He's the only soul alive who knows exactly how much of the company I actually hold. He set that trust up 17 years ago and filed every piece of paperwork like he was building a fortress, making sure every acquisition was bulletproof. By the time 2020 rolled around, I was already sitting on more than 45% of the company, and nobody in management had checked the ownership filings in years. Hank also made sure I was well-versed in Article 7 of our corporate charter, which is an emergency provision for shareholders. We sat in a corner booth at the Route 51 diner years ago, and he told me that provision was my insurance policy, though he hoped I'd never have to use it. The rules are real simple. If any officer makes a move that changes the pay or duties of a majority shareholder without asking first, that shareholder can force an emergency board meeting in 36 hours. I currently own 51% of Slocum AG and Equipment Corp., which means my stake is worth about $346 million. So, while this 27-year-old kid with a made-up title thought he was demoting a legacy employee, he was actually attacking the man who owns more than half of the company. I sat in my truck for a few minutes looking at a photo of my wife Angela and our daughter Madison. Then I gave Hank a call. He answered on the first ring and told me he'd been waiting for this to happen. After I read him the email, there was a long silence before I told him about the private equity deal they were trying to close. Hank told me the deadline was only 72 hours away, and if that deal went through, my ownership would drop below that 50% mark. You know, most folks think they can tell exactly who's in charge by looking at the name on the door or the height of the office chair, but the truth is usually buried a lot deeper than that. Some people spend their whole lives trying to look powerful, while others just quietly become the power themselves without ever raising their voice. Hank told me we needed to get moving on both of those issues immediately, and he said he was already putting the words on paper and to give him until 6:30 that evening to finish up. There was another detail I hadn't shared with him yet, but it felt like he could sense what was on my mind anyway, because I lost my wife Angela 5 years back in a car wreck on Route 50, one only about 4 miles away from that diner, where he and I used to sit and talk. She worked as a physical therapist at the county hospital, and she was the kind of soul who remembered every single patient's name and exactly what they were afraid of while they were trying to heal. Her memorial service was so crowded that people were parked all the way down the street just to say goodbye. But the week she passed, I was stuck at the plant for 72 hours straight, trying to manage a total disaster involving a hydraulic line failure in Assembly Bay 3. A pressure coupling had sheared right off the main transfer line, and if the whole system had gone down, we were looking at $11 million in damaged equipment and 3 months of zero production. I stayed in that building until every single line was pressure tested and certified to be back online, which meant I ended up missing her final 2 days on this earth. My son Connor was 17 at the time, and my daughter Madison was only 12, and they didn't have much to say about my absence back then, but they're older now. Connor is 22 and studying mechanical engineering over at the University of Illinois in Madison, is 17 and starting her senior year. Connor calls me every single Sunday, and he's turned out to be a better man than I probably gave him any reason to be, because I still haven't found a good way to explain that week to either of them. But when that quarterly bonus hit my account, I did exactly what I always did and put every single dollar in a company stock just like I always had. Hank had the Article 7 filing finished by 6:47 that Friday evening, and it officially identified the Donovan Holdings Trust as the beneficial owner of 51% of all issued shares. That one filing set two things in motion at the exact same time by forcing a mandatory board meeting within 36 hours and putting an automatic hold on any pending stock transfers. That move effectively killed Lorraine's private equity deal before her high-priced lawyers even realized they were in a fight, because the charter says no stock transfer over 5% can go through while an Article 7 action is active. That outside fund's 28% purchase was stopped dead in its tracks. While I was catching some sleep, that night things were moving fast behind the scenes because Hank's filing hit the secretary's inbox just before 7. Julia Bennett has held that job for 9 years, and she read that first paragraph over and over again before she picked up the phone to call Andrew Collins, our general counsel. Clint was busy at his son's soccer game and didn't check his messages until 9:30, but once he did, he called her back from the parking lot to find out who had filed it. When he heard it was the Donovan Holdings Trust and that I was the owner, he went home and stayed up late digging through the SEC database. He started with the most recent update from 5 months ago that showed a 51% stake, and then he scrolled back through 17 years of perfectly documented filings. He saw the share transfers from all the retiring executives like Callaway and Alderman and Whitfield, and every single one of them was time-stamped and legally sound. Clint told me later that his hands started shaking by the time he got to the 11th page, and he had to loosen his tie and pour himself a stiff drink before he finished reading all 49 pages. He ended up calling Tyler Grayson at 11:15 that night and told her she needed to be at the office first thing in the morning because her nephew had signed a document he had absolutely no authority to sign. When she asked what was going on, Clint told her straight out that I owned 51% of the company and that Bo had demoted the majority shareholder without any board approval or legal review. There was a long silence on the other end of the line because Lorraine couldn't wrap her head around the fact that I owned more of the company than every board member combined. Clint explained that since Bo's title was never actually voted on, his power to change anyone's compensation was legally invalid from the start regardless of who owned what. He told her the board had to meet by Thursday morning and that the private equity deal was frozen solid until things were resolved. Lorraine didn't say anything for a long time, and she didn't reach out to Bo, but while she was dealing with the fact that her nephew had poked a $346 million hornet's nest, Bo was busy bragging on LinkedIn. At nearly midnight, he posted about making hard calls to clear the way for the future, and he even used the word legacy as a slur while tagging the company's official account. Hank's team had a screenshot of that post added to our legal evidence by 8 the next morning. I woke up Wednesday at 5:30 and made some strong black coffee before letting my old yellow lab Rex out into the yard. He's 9 years old now and moves a bit slower than he used to as we stood there in the dark looking out at the grain silos on the horizon. My phone was blowing up with 12 missed calls by 6:50 from Bo and Lorraine and the company lawyers, but I didn't return a single one of them except for Hank. He told me the board was confirmed for Thursday morning and that every director had already seen the ownership papers. When I asked him what the mood was like, he told me it was ice cold because the 3 directors who had fought against Bo's appointment from the beginning were already calling for blood. Hank told me that those directors weren't just leaning our way, they had actually been looking for an escape route from the situation for months. And as for that private equity deal, Lorraine's legal team called his office first thing that morning trying to find a loophole. But there simply wasn't one to be found because the hole we placed was airtight and would stay in effect until the board reached a final resolution, so the outside investors knew the game was up and were already preparing to. Walk away, I looked out my kitchen window at those grain silos while Rex came back inside to find a spot on the floor for a nap, and I told Hank I'd be there at 9:45, though he said he wanted to be in his seat by 9:30, and then he told me to make sure I wore my best suit for the occasion. I spent that Wednesday keeping my hands busy with 3 specific things, starting with a trip to the hardware store over on Route 9 to grab a new hinge for my back gate that had been acting up since the end of summer, and I spent about 35 minutes out there replacing it while Rex just sat in the grass and watched me work like I was doing something profound. After that, I drove over to the Route 51 diner and sat in one of those old vinyl booths where the same waitress has been working since. Before I even started at the company, I sat by the window with a turkey club and black coffee eating. Slowly, like a man who didn't have a single deadline in the world, the lunch crowd was mostly local guys from the co-op and some farmers from the next county over, and none of them had the slightest clue who I was or what was about to happen to a nearly $700 million company. Just 12 miles down the road, my phone was buzzing in my pocket the whole time, but I just turned it face down on the table and ignored it by the end of the day. I had almost a dozen more missed calls from Bo and Lorraine in the front office, but I didn't feel the need to talk to any of them because Hank had already given me the only update that mattered. Everything else could wait until Thursday morning. I got home and took care of the house and fed the dog before sitting down in the kitchen to look at a photo of Angela on the fridge from years ago where she was laughing at our son's graduation, and I could see so much of her in our kids. Connor has those same eyes, and Madison has that quiet way of observing everything before she make her move. I thought about what Ned used to tell me about owning what you build, and the truth is I'd been living by those words for 17 years without ever mentioning it to a soul, not even to my own wife or children. I went to bed early and slept like a baby before waking up at 5:30 on Thursday morning to put on that charcoal suit Angela picked out for me. Years ago, she always said it made me look like I meant business, and I'd only taken it out of the closet twice since she passed away. I fixed my tie in the mirror, and then I reached for that silver pen I'd carried with me through all those consecutive years. When we finally sat down in that boardroom, Beau's hand started drifting toward his laptop, but Lorraine stopped him with a single word before he could even open it. And then Clint, our counsel, started reading from the documents. He explained that I was the majority shareholder with a stake worth about $346 million, which is more than half the company's total value. And he also pointed out that Beau's fancy title had never actually been made official by a board vote, which meant he never had the legal right to change anyone's pay or position in the first place. Beau looked at me, and for the once in his life, he wasn't putting on an act. He tried to claim the filings couldn't be right, but Hank just calmly reminded him that we had 17 years of perfectly legal documentation, including 49 pages of filings and a screenshot of Beau's own boastful LinkedIn post as evidence of his intentions. The vote didn't take long at all, and it went exactly how you'd expect, with every single director voting to reverse the demotion and remove Beau from his position immediately while appointing me as the new CEO of the people. Who had hated Beau's appointment from the start didn't hesitate for a second, and when it finally came down to Lorraine, she looked at her nephew with a look of pure realization, like she was finally seeing him for who he really was. She knew what it took to build that company, and she knew the cost of his mistake. So she voted right along with the rest of them, making a unanimous 8-0. Beau stood up like he was waiting for someone to jump in and save him, but nobody moved, and then he had the nerve to ask why. I just sat there on Friday without saying a word, and I told him straight out that I didn't have anything to say before security walked him out of the building for the last time. 2 hours later, I was officially the CEO, and I spent the afternoon in Clint's office signing the transition papers while he admitted that he'd just assumed someone else was keeping track of the ownership filings all these years. Within a month and a half, the board approved a major dividend that put $9 million in my pocket, and by the second month, the company had filed a $22 million lawsuit against Beau for breach of duty, because taking a shot at the majority shareholder while trying to push a private equity deal isn't just a mistake, it's a legal disaster, and we had all the proof we needed. Lorraine ended up stepping down from the board about a week after that vote, sending an short letter that I read once before filing it away for good. Lorraine and Roy spent better than 2 decades pouring their lives into this company, and she managed to keep it all from falling apart for 8 long years after he was gone, which is the kind of effort that earns you a seat at the table regardless of how things ended. She let her love for that nephew of hers get in the way of her common sense. And in the end, it cost her every single thing she'd spent 30 years building. And that's a heavy enough burden to carry without me adding any more weight to it. I moved into that corner office eventually, since it had been hers for a generation before Beau tried to claim it the second he got that fake title. I had all of his things packed into boxes and sent straight to his apartment. The same afternoon, he was escorted out of the boardroom. I put Angela's photo right there on the desk, the one where she's laughing at Madison's middle school graduation with the sun in her eyes, and I tucked Ned's silver pen into the top drawer where I can reach for it without even thinking about it. The nameplate on the door finally says CEO, just like it should have a long time ago. Connor gave me a call that Sunday, just like he always does, and he got real quiet for a minute after I told him the news before asking if I really owned the whole company. I told him I'd walk him through the whole story when I see him at Thanksgiving, and he just let out a laugh that sounded like he was seeing his old man for the first time. Madison sent me a text later that night with just 3 words saying she knew it all along, and while I don't know exactly what she'd figured out, she's definitely her mother's daughter, so she probably had the whole thing mapped out before I even did. Out on the shop floor, Denise Harper is still running Bay 1, and Walter Briggs is still sitting at the security desk. And I can still see those grain silos on the horizon from my back porch every single morning because a new name on a door doesn't change the soul of the place. The work stays the same and the people stay the same, and I just happen to hold a much bigger piece of the pie on paper than I did a month ago. What matters now is what has always mattered, which is making sure the equipment ships out right and the lines run clean, and treating the people who do the actual labor like they're the reason the building is still standing. Because the truth is, they are. Ned knew that, and Roy knew it too. But somewhere along the line, Lorraine forgot it or started believing that forward thinking was more important than actual results, and Bo never had enough dirt under his fingernails to understand it to begin with. I keep that pen in the top drawer because I don't need to look at the words to know exactly what they say. If you've ever had a kid half your age look at 20 years of your life's work and call it dead weight, then you know exactly how I felt on that Friday. And if you've ever been the smartest guy in the room while everyone else talked over you, then you know why I didn't say a word when that email arrived. The time to speak up wasn't that Friday afternoon. It was 2 weeks later when the room was already decided and I was holding all the cards. Here is the one thing 19 years will teach you that no business school ever will, which is that loyalty without equity is just a bad habit, and showing up without ownership is nothing but hard labor. The men who built things worth keeping understood that, and Ned proved it when he handed me a pen and told me to own what I build, and then left me to figure out the rest for myself. So if you're still in a room doing the work and being ignored by people who just inherited their seats, stay patient, keep track of everything, and learn the rules of the game better than anyone else in the building. Because the man who builds it quietly is usually the one who ends up owning the whole thing. They just don't realize he's been the one signing their paychecks since the day they thought they were in charge.